Good morning, everyone, to our special Meet an Expert session today. It's a very great privilege to welcome a return speaker who's kindly agreed to come along to speak to us again about nutrition in space and analog studies. So delighted to welcome Kristine Atienza from the Philippines back again. Thank you very much for coming. And I will just read out Kristine's short bio and then hand over to her. Kristine is a registered nutritionist dietitian from the Philippines, working as a public health nutritionist for the United Nations. She is also active in the space and astronomy community, both locally and internationally. Kristine is an analog astronaut for the high seas or the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. She was also part of the Space Generation Advisory Council as an executive secretary for 4 years and still active in different project groups and task forces of the organisation. Kristine is a member of a working group of the International Astronomical Union for Diversity and Inclusion. She works with colleagues from Europe and the Middle East and is part of the founding members of the Astronaut Nutrition in Isolated Confined Extreme Environments, or ANICE. Kristine has done some small studies on space nutrition for analog missions like Asclepios, Chill Ice, and Lunares, with the goal of quantifying the impact of diet and nutrition before, during, and after the mission on astronaut physiology and psychology. So thank you again, Kristine, for coming along today, and I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rowena, for inviting me again. I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Kristine. I'm a registered nutritionist dietitian from the Philippines, and my day job, my day job is in public health and humanitarian work. So I worked for the United Nations before, and then I'm also active in the space community. So I'm doing studies for space nutrition, though I can't call myself a space nutritionist because I don't think we have that. It's very niche. It's a very niche field. So I'm not comfortable referring to myself as space nutritionist, but I'm doing small studies on space nutrition for analog missions. And I'm also an I'm also an analog astronaut myself for the high seas or the Hawaiian space exploration and analog and simulation. So this is just an overview of space nutrition. So we'll discuss for today the nutrition during training or during analog and during space missions, and nutrition and psychology during missions, and then space food storage practices in the ISS, and HACCP, the concept of HACCP. So this is humans need for food. So I always tell this to everyone. Always tell this to even to analog crew members. So I'm also a nutritionist for analog crew members before for Iceland, Poland, and Switzerland. So I always tell them that food is not just a sustenance for the body, but it's also cultural. So food affects almost everything that we do. So food is not just for countermeasures of the negative effects of space, but it's also we need to bring nutrition and food to space for to preserve our culture as well. So, overview of optimal nutrition for spaceflight. So, what is the importance of nutrition to manned spaceflight, and can nutrition serve as countermeasure for muscle wasting and bone loss during spaceflight? And why is it important to consider the whole person during spaceflight? So, for today, we'll discuss why space nutrition. Again, it's very niche, and even for us nutritionists, actually, it's very unheard of. Like, I've known a few nutritionists who are also interested in space. So it's very new for us, even for the nutrition community. So why space nutrition? First, of course, we need space nutrition for maintenance of good crew and high overall performance. And then we need nutrition, of course, to prevent nutritional deficiencies and subsequent disease, just like here on Earth. So it's also the same concept here on Earth. We use nutrition to prevent diseases. And then we need adequate, safe, and reliable food supply, especially for long duration missions when we go to the moon or the Mars, or on the Mars. And then of course also we need adequate and safe food also in the International Space Station. And hopefully it can support also the colonization or the food cultivation in during long-term missions if we terraform the moon or the Mars in the future. And then again, as I said a while ago, it's the preservation of food culture and sustenance of mental health. So imagine yourself eating repacked food for 2 years going to Mars. So we need to also preserve our mental health through food. So this table shows the required nutrient intake on the International Space Station. So there are nutrient requirements for the ISS, and there's specific one for NASA, but it's kind of the same. So for this slide, we will discuss mostly the macronutrients, but we also have nutritional requirements for micronutrients as well. But this time we'll just discuss the carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So for carbohydrates, you can see that it's 50 to 55% WHO. So our standards now that we use is based on the WHO guidelines. We don't have like a guideline for the International Space Station because we don't have enough subjects or test subjects, or we don't have enough data set to have a reference specifically for the International Space Station or on the moon, because we only have like 600 astronauts right now. So we still use the WHO guidelines. But I think that's what I'm also trying to figure out is what requirements do we need when we go on the moon or on the Mars. So for carbohydrates, again, it's 50 to 55. And then for protein, it's 12 to 15%. And for fat, it's 30 to 35% for the ISS. So this is the computation for the energy requirement. So W is for weight. So for 18 to 30 years old, it's 1.7 times 15.3 times the weight of the person plus 679. So it's a straightforward computation, but sometimes we need to add 500 extra calories if their physical expenditure for that day is a lot, or if they're doing EVAs or extravehicular activities. So we need to add more calories for that. But yeah, so the equation is just straightforward. So again, this is the requirements. So for dietary fiber, we need to add dietary fiber for astronauts because the what they call this, from the mouth to cecum, the food the digestion is very slow, so we need to add more carbohydrate, dietary fiber for astronauts. And for protein, the recommended is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, but it cannot exceed 35% of the total daily energy intake. And for fat, it's 25 to 35 of the total daily energy intake. And so there's an interesting study that LDL increase, or the LDL increase in weight loss in space, but here on Earth LDL decreases if we have weight loss in gravity. So we don't know yet why LDL increases while astronauts lose their body weight in space. So yeah. So the main contributing factor of the nutritional requirement in space is microgravity, because our body is very used to 1G. But of course, when you go to outer space or in the ISS, the gravity would decrease. So we don't rely now in gravity in our physiological function. So it causes a lot. It causes a lot of problems, especially for nutrient intake, because of gravity, they lost appetite. Astronauts lost appetite because their taste functions are altered because of fluid shift inside the body as well. There are also flight related changes in gastrointestinal function, and there's also space motion sickness. So most of the time astronauts lose weight because they couldn't eat, especially for short-term missions or for about a week mission, so they would lose weight. But for long-term missions in the ISS, for example, 6 months, they would kind of increase their intake. They would increase their protein intake. Sometimes their protein intake is more than the recommended. So we also need to check those because if we increase protein, that might lead to renal stones, etc. So for nutrition, the main concern actually for astronauts are muscle atrophy and bone loss. So for bone loss, astronauts would have this bone like osteoporosis like bone when they do a long term space mission. So what they do heavy resistance exercise and of course good nutrition and vitamin D and vitamin K status. So for heavy resistance exercise, astronauts in the International Space Station do 2.5 hours of exercise per day for 6 days a week. For analog missions or analog trainings, we do 1 hour resistance trainings per day. So you need to do more exercise in when you're in the space station, when you're in the International Space Station. So again, we also have muscle loss in microgravity. So in the absence of gravity, the muscles in the legs and back begin to weaken and atrophy as they are no longer required to support the weight of the astronauts. So countermeasure is adequate energy intake of protein and use of protein and amino acid supplementation. But this is inconclusive as of writing because the research now in protein intake is not it's varying, so it's not conclusive as of yet if it's really helpful to supplement protein during flight or space flight to prevent muscle loss. And then so nutrition for analog astronauts. So again, because there are a few astronauts like astronauts in space, we do analog astronaut missions to check the nutritional requirements or how to do countermeasures using nutrition because first of all it's very expensive. So again, analog getting anything into outer space is very expensive. It would cost 10,000 of USD per kilogram of payload. So we do a lot of analog missions, and there are lots of analog missions depending on the goal of an analog. So there are analogs in the Antarctic to simulate the temperature and the darkness of space, and we also have like high altitude analogs like the high seas where I did my training, and there are also like a hydronaut or underwater analog. So one analog is actually bed rest study, or participants would just lie on bed for long durations of time. This is to test muscle atrophy or how to counter muscle atrophy. So this is the main function of bed rest because especially during Mars mission for humans who will go to Mars, they would need to be inside a capsule for about 2 years. So imagine yourself being in a capsule for 2 years. So there's also simulation for that. I think NASA's Hera is also a capsule-like simulation. And then there are underwater analogs. So there are decreased energy intake and weight loss during the dive, similar to what we see in the International Space Station. And we can also check oxidative damages and stress during dive because of high oxygen concentration and pressure inside the body because of the spacesuit and the habitat itself. So we can check oxidative damage using underwater analog. And then for Antarctic research, because they have like 6 months of darkness, we can model vitamin D deficiency for space flight as well. So I think this is, I think, Canada, Mars Arctic Research Station or ESA. And then we also have altitude sickness to simulate space motion sickness. So actually, I've experienced this myself because I'm from the Philippines. So we're on the we call this we're on just sea level. So when I went to high seas, which is 8,200 feet above sea level, my blood pressure would go up. I would have like altitude sickness a bit, not too much, but I would feel fatigued because of altitude sickness. So I couldn't eat that much, and I would feel very lethargic because of probably high blood pressure. So my blood pressure would go up to 140 every morning. The good thing is we have AI pet seal robot. So that helped me. That helped my blood pressure actually and my stress level to go down. And then yeah, nutrition and psychology. So we also check on psychology and food basically during analog missions because we need to check people. For example, there are missions that we need to feed analog astronauts vegan food for the whole duration of mission for 1 month. So we need to check their psychology before and after that, especially when they're not vegan before they went to the mission. Because why vegan? Because that's probably what would astronauts going to Mars or the moon would eat vegetarian food. So no meat because meat is has a lot of weight, so it weighs more than vegetable and it's easier to transport basically. Moving on to space food, I think this is space food. So moving on to space food. So this is the brief history of space food over time. So in the 1960s, they used military foods in the 1960s, and in 1962, they tested if astronauts could eat in space. In 1961 to 1975, they mainly used dehydrated milk, coffee, grape juice, and soup that can be eaten with some water. And then in 1969, they used spoon bowl pack and that could have hot water added. For 1973 to 1974, a dining room. Already have a dining room in the Skylab. And then 1970s and 80s, there are 70 food items in space. And now we have 200 to 300 food items for astronauts right now, but it's mainly American and Russian, but yeah, astronauts can get the taste test before they go to outer space, so they can choose their preferred food when they go to outer space, especially because they couldn't eat as well as when they're on Earth. So we need to see their preferences as well. They can eat like their comfort food like M&Ms or chocolate. So there are options like that now, but still limited. So 300 and mostly American and Russian menu. So, what are the rules for creating new space food? First, minimize crumbs. So we couldn't have crumbs floating around the International Space Station because it might damage the equipment in the International Space Station. So that's number one. Number one rule is minimize crumbs. And second is minimize packaging because they don't have like trash. There are a few shuttles going back to Earth that can transport their trashes back to Earth. So they need to minimize the packaging and trash volume. And again, to minimize the weight of the food. That's why most of the food that we eat, even for analog missions, are freeze-dried vegetables or plant-based food because it has less weight. So for exercise, you can use the chat if you want. So can you bring croissant in the International Space Station based on the rules that I showed you a while ago? Can astronauts eat croissant? Okay, no crumbs. How about tortilla? Or tortilla? I can see check mark there. Yes, tortilla. Berries? Yes. How about prawns? Prawns? No. Okay, let's see. Next slide. So yes, you can eat croissant is because too many crumbs. Oops, sorry. For tortilla, yes, actually this is the most common food item. Not most common, but mostly appreciated food item in the International Space Station because they can make sandwiches out of a tortilla. And then for berries, it can only go if it's freeze dried or dried, freeze dried mainly, or lyophilized. For prawns, it can go to outer space and but it needs to be cooked or thermostabilized or dehydrated. And this is most of the most favorite food item in the International Space Station because of probably the sauce. Because the sauce of the prawns or yeah, because the sauce of the prawns is it's spicy. So astronauts actually like spicier food in the International Space Station. So these are the kinds of items that would go to outer space. So lyophossilized, this is also what we eat during our analog mission, mostly lyophossilized. So freeze-dried everything. So it's a process involving freezing substance at very low temperature and extracting liquid. So basically all our vegetables are freeze-dried and we need to rehydrate it to make it look like vegetables again, kind of. It doesn't, yeah, but it kind of look like vegetables again, but that's the best thing that we can have even for analog while lyophossilized, because it can the nutrients are still intact when you lyophossilized, so it's a good way to lessen the weight of the food, and at the same time it's a good way to preserve the nutrients inside the food. And thermostabilized, most meats are thermostabilized, so most of the food in the international station, even now, they just rehydrate even the meat. It doesn't look appetizing because it looked mushy, most of them, but that's the best that they can have right now. Question: does any one of you have you tried or have you seen astronaut ice cream before? So you can buy it in a science store. But do you think astronauts do eat that ice cream? So actually, they can't eat that ice cream because there are too many crumbs. So our childhood is a lie. Just kidding. But yeah, you can't eat that ice cream in the International Space Station. Okay, so cutlery in space. So astronauts use knives and forks to eat just as the same at home, but they need scissors and they need this kind of plate, like a tray, to attach it on the wall so that their food won't fly. But astronauts, they can play their food because they would just float around. This is a space kitchen. Oh, well, this is not a space kitchen. It doesn't look like this. So the ISS does not have a freezer. So the food should be stable or stable for about 9 months, 6 to 9 months, because they don't have a freezer. And then there's no dishwasher, so we need to have a disposable container for the food. And then there's no hob at the ISS, so astronauts have to use a food warmer or galley, which is similar to an oven at home. There's also no sink, but they have specialized water gun to rehydrate their food. So this is what it looks like. So this is their rehydration station. And this is their table, and this is where they strap their food so it won't fly away. This is the last slide. So HACCP, so Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. So the HACCP was a concept first developed in the 1960s by the U.S. National Air, by NASA, working with Pillsbury to ensure crumb and pathogen-free food that had extensive shelf life, properties for space travel. So this is the first pathogen monitoring and measurement requirement. And this came from the space industry, but HACCP is also used nowadays in every restaurant or in every food service here on Earth. So this is one of the few things that space benefit us here on Earth. So this process is one of those things. So for HACCP, it's critical control point. So every step of the way, from procurement down to preparation of food to delivery of food to the International Space Station. So they have critical control points to check. So it's a whole concept, it's a whole process. But yeah, this is one of the things that we're using now here on Earth as well. And yeah, I think that's the end of my slide. And apologies for the technical difficulties with my Canva. Apologies for that. Thank you for listening.
No, no problem at all. Thank you very much. That was a really wonderful talk, really, really interesting. And I think you've given us a beautiful coverage of all the complex issues associated with both food and nutrition and health and well-being in space and on analog studies. And the point that you raised at the end about the importance of making sure that things are safe as well as nutritious is incredibly important, especially as we're thinking about going further out to the moon and Mars, as you mentioned at the start. So thank you very much indeed. And we have plenty of time for questions. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to ask, either unmute or pop it in the chat. And I'm sure Kristine will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Hi, Kristine.
Hello.
I was just wondering, do you personally have a favorite meal from your analog missions?
Oh yeah, yeah, actually. So our commander cooked us. She's Belgian, so she cooked us pasta. I'm not sure what the name of the pasta was, but it really felt like home. Because yeah, I think that's one of the, I think for me, space food especially, or food when you're in a mission, even if it's just an analog mission, food is very crucial for maintaining our sanity. So when I ate that food that she made for us, it really felt like home, even though I'm not Belgian or European, but that tastes like homemade meal. So that really increased my morale during that day.
Hi, Kristine. I
Yes.
have a question on sort of the high carb nature of the diet of astronauts. Like in that, how did they arrive at that decision to include mostly carbs? And then secondly, have they also looked at other kinds of diets, like a high fat diet or high protein diets?
Oh, so actually, it's kind of similar also here on Earth. The carbohydrate requirement is kind of similar too. We just need to prevent ketosis when we're in space. So that's why we need that amount of carbohydrate, like 50 to 55% of the energy intake. Yeah, we need to prevent ketosis and renal stones because of high protein intake. For other diet like high protein diet. They haven't tried that before. I think they're looking at vegan food really. Like I think that's the most common study right now is vegan food. But I haven't seen like high protein diet because intake protein intake right now in the ISS is higher than recommended. Like astronauts would eat more protein when they're in the more long term mission in the ISS. So uh, yeah, I haven't read about studies on like high protein diet in the International Space Station. This mainly they just use the WHO guidelines.
Thank you. And I see that another student has the same question. What's the reason behind preventing ketosis in space?
Well, it's the same here on Earth, like just us humans. So it's very harmful for astronauts' health. Even when they go back to space, so we need to prevent that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions anybody has? Yes, we do have another question there from Nathan, who has asked, are there specific water intake requirements for astronauts?
I think it's just similar to Earth, but let me look into that again. I'm not really sure, but I think it's just similar.
Any other questions? And maybe I'll just mention something if we're thinking about going to Mars in particular. From what I've read and what I've heard, there seems to be some thought that it'll have to be a combination of what you can take on the mission, thinking about mass and volume constraints, what astronauts can grow on the mission, which will probably have to be vegan rather than any other kind of nutrition. And also the idea of potentially pre-positioning some supplies on the surface of Mars. So the food items that they send to Mars could potentially be there for a very long time. So there's the question of the longevity of the food and the stability of the nutritional components. And I was just wondering, do you have any insights into the research that's going on about what foods might be good to keep stable for several years, sitting on the surface of Mars where there's lots of radiation and things? Thank you.
Oh, so I think so I was part of the Deep Space Food Challenge for NASA before. So I think they're trying to because you can't really have a stable food for that long. So they're trying to make a system that can make food after the first ration of food. So there's food ration, mostly pre-packed vegetarian food, and then they would need another system to make new batch of food for them. So yeah, there are lots of studies like using algae for the food base and then adding certain nutrients for that food item from algae. So yeah, so basically what they're trying to study right now, I think, so as far as I've known, is creating a machine or a food system that can create food after the food ration is depleted. But to answer the question about the water intake, yes, I just look it up. So it's the same. It's 1 gallon. Yeah, it's 1 gallon per day. So it's kind of similar here on Earth, but they use recycled water, so it's kind of easy for them to drink their own urine, recycled urine.
And we have another question from Sinead. How recent was the shift to vegan space food, or has it always been a recommendation for space food?
Actually, this is just very recent. So I think I've started to. There are like studies. I've seen studies or a lot of studies for vegan food during the pandemic. Not for the International Space Station, but for the lunar base or Martian base, because as I mentioned before, it's easier to transport. So mostly, probably the astronauts who would go to outer space or no, not outer space, would go to Mars would need to be vegan. Yeah, so that's why we're kind of shifting our studies in analog missions for vegan food. So question is, how are dietary intolerances and allergens accounted first for in space? So they do a lot of checkup before flight, so everything, even for allergens, and they also have medicines for allergens, and I think space pharmacologists can answer that better. But yeah, I think they also do have some pills for allergens. Maybe Dr. Rowena can answer that.
Thanks. Yes, we did actually have that question asked before with one of our previous guest lecturers who works at NASA, and he said that although they don't deliberately screen out people with food tolerances, at the same time, it is seen as an issue, because if you've got to have special food for people who are gluten-free, for instance, then that actually restricts the volume of food variety that you can take for the other astronauts, because there's always that balancing act between the sort of mass and volume constraints and what you can take up. And it's also a little bit potentially of a psychological issue, particularly on a longer mission, that the person with the dietary intolerances is sort of getting special food, and other people are having to eat all the other food, and then there's always the risk that people will start getting into each other's food supplies, and that could also disrupt what's available for people who have genuine intolerances. So given that there are so many people who want to be astronauts, and the majority of those are going to be perfectly healthy without any intolerance issue, they're certainly going to prefer to take people who don't have those issues, particularly for a longer space mission, just because it just becomes very, very logistically complex to handle that. So I hope
Yeah.
that answers the question.
Yeah. And also, as I mentioned a while ago, they have, before their missions, they will have food tasting sessions. So I think they can also check their preferences, even if they have allergies, they can tell their nutritionist or the food team before their mission. So yeah, so the food that they would bring would be, would be safe for them.
Okay. Any last questions before we finish for today? No? All right. Well, I think all that remains is to say thank you very much again to Kristine for coming along today, all the way from the Philippines, and giving us a wonderful talk and sharing your insights. We very genuinely appreciate it, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.